there's this sort of uncomfortability. And I think that's where I would sit myself in terms of that sort of huge discussion around the body, and especially the female body, is just hoping that people realize realize themselves being both the voyeur and the object.
Welcome to the Flying Fruit Bowl, a platform dedicated to the discussion and exploration of art and the creative process. In this episode, I had the chance to talk to the artist Felicity Beaumont. Felicity is a UK-based artist who creates interesting abstract figures that recontextualise and reconsider the human form. Taking inspiration from media such as magazines and films, her work opens up discourse around the representation and objectification of the female body. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Felicity, and there may even be a part 2 to this interview, so I hope you enjoy it. Best place to start is, as with everybody, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became an artist.
So I studied fine art at the University of Suffolk, graduated in 2019. So I've always had an interest in art and painting. My dad was a ceramicist, so it's always been sort of part of my background. I grew up sort of making things, helping him out with pottery and stuff. So it was always something I was interested in, but I didn't really take the leap into pursuing it until I left high school and sixth form. And I sort of took a few years out before uni and didn't really know what I was going to do. And I just always found myself coming back to painting and just thought, well, if I enjoy doing it, I might as well study it as well. So, like I say, completed my BA in 2019. And since then, it's just sort of snowballed with exhibiting and doing collaborations, working with charities and all sorts of stuff like that. And off to do my master's in September.
Oh, wow.
So I'll be doing that as well. But yeah, it's sort of, I guess it comes from a place of sort of trying to put yourself into a place in the world. And I think people find a different way of doing that. Like a lot of people through their work, but some people through hobbies. And I think as a creative, we sort of strive to do that through our work. So it's always for me been quite a personal thing. I started off looking at portraiture, which I think is quite a traditional way to get into painting for a lot of artists. But I found myself always just fascinated by the human form and the body, in terms of the aesthetic, but also in terms of the idea that because we all inhabit a body, it's such a universal concept. So I hope that when people view art that is figurative, it's sort of, there's a connection, even if you don't know much about the artwork. So I think that's where I started getting interested in figurative art. And it's just sort of built on from there, with looking at everything from like the explicit to traditional life drawing, sort of the female experience of the body, also looking at notions of diversity and like representation, all this sort of stuff. And yeah, it just sort of compacts down into my practice, which I think is just, I'm interested in discussing the body in the contemporary world, because it is still such a not taboo, but sort of difficult topic to approach still, even though we've come leaps and bounds in terms of like equality and representation and destigmatization of like the nude and stuff, but it's still a bit of a hot topic in terms of how people feel about it, because it is a universal thing. So I think that's where my practice sort of sits, really.
Absolutely, and you have a blog as well, which is really, really amazing.
Indeed, yes.
I spent I've spent quite a while looking through it, and I really have enjoyed reading it. Your work's really fascinating on a lot of different planes. For me personally, on a lot of different planes, because the subject matter is fascinating, and then reading you write about it is fascinating. Because I think what I find is a lot of artists don't necessarily write about their work and consider the wider context of art. Because even like, for instance, you wrote a post about COVID-19 and the value of art, and I thought that's so interesting to think that you're thinking about that, because to be honest, like, how many artists are actually thinking about that, or how many artists are at least sitting down and evaluating that, and then also putting it online so they can reflect upon it themselves? Because I'm imagining that, like, next year, for instance, you'll look at this, you'll probably reread your blog post and be like, oh, okay, that's how I was in that headspace then.
Yeah, definitely. That's the thing with the blog. I think it's sort of always, I mean, I found it so useful when I was studying to have this sort of reflective practice. So, working in sketchbooks and stuff, I would make notes and stuff. And then when I graduated, it just felt like this natural progression to keep doing a regular reflection and regular investigation of what I was doing, but also what was going on in the world and how that was affecting it. Because I find my work so influenced by how I'm feeling, or like by stuff I see on social media or anything like that. I think it felt relevant still to be reflecting on the blog. I haven't unfortunately published much recently, just because of personal circumstances, and with the pandemic going on, I've had to move studios and all sorts of stuff has happened. So it hasn't been top priority at the moment. But yeah, it's I love going back and reading it sometimes, and looking back at different things, or I'll think of something, I'm like, oh, I've just thought of that, and didn't that link to something I thought of last year? And then I'll be like, oh, I wonder where I could find that. And then I'll be like, oh, I think I wrote a blog post about that, so I can like go back on. And yeah, I think it's important as an artist to sort of relate your work to external things, within your own life, but also within a wider context. Like I say, especially something like COVID, there's no way that anyone hasn't been affected by it in some small way or some big way. Yeah, so I just felt like, because of I'm massively interested in the whole sort of minutiae of the art market anyway. I actually wrote my dissertation at uni on sort of value and arts commodity and that sort of thing. So when I was considering it in terms of how something as monumental as a global pandemic can affect it, it just seemed like, well, surely everyone's thinking about this. But then obviously, like you say, maybe everyone's not.
No, because it's not something I was thinking about personally until I read your blog post, and I was like, you know, what, actually, this is a really interesting topic to think about. And actually, I kind of thank you a bit because it's going to be something I'm going to ask somebody in my next interview, most likely.
Oh, brilliant.
I think your work is it can divide people. Because it can divide people, it gives it a sense of like, you don't quite know the artist's true intentions. Like, are they just doing it because, oh, news are popular? People, they might just be painting news are popular and they just want, to be popular. So it's really cool to see your thought process behind the work, and kind of, not that you have to justify it, but like the justification and the kind of the validity of yourself as an artist through your own eyes as opposed to externally. I think that's really good to see.
Oh, great.
And I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And going back to your studies, actually. So how did you find studying art?
That is a really good question, actually. And one of my favorite topics with my fellow students when I was at uni. I found it very, very different to what I expected, to be honest. Um, and I found, in all honesty, I absolutely hated the first year. I don't know whether that was, we had a lot of like course reshuffling at my uni the first year I was studying, because it used to be an extension of the University of East Anglia, and then it got its own university status. There were just a lot of changes happening, so that probably affected it. But essentially, it felt very sort of unpersonal, and we were very much put in boxes as artists, which a lot of us were still working out what we wanted to do, myself included. Not just in terms of medium, but even just like what we wanted to look at, what we wanted to think about. And they were very much like, right, are you a painter or are you a sculptor? And it was like, what? I don't know.
It could be
So
both.
yeah, exactly. So the first year I think I struggled to find my feet a little bit, but then the second and third year, I just absolutely loved it. I realized how much, it's interesting now that you bring up the blog. I realized how much that I linked my own life and my own experiences to art without really noticing until I sat down and thought about it, and just the way I thought about everything. So I really I definitely dived into the theoretical side as well. I mean, I definitely class myself as a nerd when it comes to art theory in that respect. And I sort of refound the reason why I'd pursued it, which was great. But it was also obviously challenging. I mean, as it is with being a professional artist, the sort of time management, juggling stuff, like you say, not only creating work that you enjoy and are proud of, but then marketing it, learning the technicalities of putting on an exhibition, um, like obviously doing all the written work as well. So it was a lot and it was full on, but I absolutely loved it. And I think I learned so much that I never would have even been aware of had I not gone to uni to study art, and had I just sort of, or I probably would have done, but much later in my career.
Yeah, do you think it's important for artists to have a degree in art or at least some kind of creative practice?
Um, I think it massively depends on the artist. I think for me, I think it was for me. I think my experience at university shaped the work I'm creating now. But I think for a lot of people, if they've happened to find their interest earlier on or later on, but having not studied art or studied at all, I think it just there's a moment when it clicks dependent on certain timing. So, I know people that have gone back to art when they're like 60 and suddenly been like, oh, I've been drawing sunflowers all my life and I should have been drawing lilies and now it all makes sense. So yeah, I think it definitely helped me to contextualize my work and to understand the wider art world outside of just I like the look of that, I'll paint it. But I think I still would have pursued arts, but potentially later on in life.
That's actually really interesting. That's a really interesting answer. Because I think with art as well, I think creative degrees are kind of not frowned upon, but they're not exactly they're not the first thing in the prospectus, are they? Let's be honest.
Exactly. And I think this was the reason I sort of held back from going to university for a few years, is because I'd always sort of considered art, but had not been pushed away from it or anything, but yeah, just sort of felt, oh, it's not a real job, which I think there's still that massive stigma around the arts, which is crazy when you think about every little thing that we do every day is somehow affected by some form of art.
Absolutely. But I was going to say, so what are your thoughts on that idea of that stigma in terms of how do you think that we, if we can, how do you think that we can overcome that?
I think with most things it comes down to sort of accessibility and removing the idea that art is somehow exclusive. I think we're definitely moving away from that, like the white cube gallery idea. That sort of thing is progressing, and I think in some ways the effects of COVID-19 will potentially help that. I mean, we're seeing so many more online exhibitions, interactive gallery tours, all this sort of thing, which opens up the door to people that potentially wouldn't just wander into an art gallery. But I think it's a difficult thing to overcome because it is so ingrained that, even when I tell people I'm an artist, they're like, oh, what do you do? Just draw fruit or something. It's still, there's definitely a stigma around it.
Even if you did that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Exactly. But I think people, they sort of try and minimize it down to the very basics without understanding, what it actually entails to be an artist or to study art. And so, yeah, I think the only way is just to continue making it more accessible and, championing artists from different backgrounds and from all over the place and different experiences so that it becomes something that everyone can relate to, because I think that's where it stems from, is obviously, you know, centuries ago it was only the rich who could afford a painting. So obviously that's just not carried on, but that's progressed and evolved as society has. But now I think, you know, well, I'm like, galleries have been doing virtual tours for free on YouTube, all that sort of thing. So anyone can do it, anyone can get involved in it. But I think it's taking that step to realizing it is for everyone and it's not just for, you know, the typical or the stereotypical like art critic in their black polo shirt and glasses and a beret or something. So I think, yeah, it's just continuing to do more interesting stuff and getting the word out there, I guess, like with anything.
That's yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what's the most challenging part of being an artist for you?
That's a good question. I think probably a combination of time management, but that might just be a personal thing, and the sort of not motivation, but keeping yourself motivated and having the confidence to keep going and knowing that this is what you want to do, especially when you're sort of an emerging artist and not making much, if any, money from it. That I think, yeah, I think the struggle of sort of knowing that what you're doing is, even if you're not making the most amazing work in the world, it's part of the process. And I think knowing that you need to just keep going and sort of having that, yeah, I don't know if the word is motivation or more like
Yeah, no,
consistent.
it'd be motivation, the self motivation.
Yeah, I
Um,
definitely think that's part of the struggle, is having the confidence and the motivation to sort of almost stick to your guns and like trust yourself.
yeah, because obviously, like I do photography, so I'm very aware. Like it's hard. It's hard to just to create. It's actually really hard to create, and I think people don't necessarily seem to understand that it's not. It doesn't just come to you naturally all the time. Like sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Ebbs and flows, like everything else in life. And I think trying to find motivation just to create another piece, or kind of even just expand upon ideas, or even just find new ideas. it can be a huge, yeah, that's definitely, that's a great answer, I think, because it's a very honest answer, and I appreciate that as well. Because you could have said like, oh, the technical aspect or something else, but like I appreciate that. It's an honest answer. So how do you stay motivated then? Actually, moving on to the question.
Um, I mean, just like you just said, it does ebb and flow. I mean, it's very much it depends time to time. The last sort of couple of months have been definitely much harder to keep motivated. Um, but I think the biggest motivation is the enjoyment still. I think aside from, working on a commission or working with somebody or to a deadline or something like that, aside from all the other pressures, I think at the end of the day, if you're an artist, you're doing it because you love it. And so that you're always going to come back to it, even in a small way. And I think it's just maintaining that sort of remembering how much you want to do it, how much you enjoy doing it while you're doing it. It's like with runners high, I'm not a runner at all, but I have friends who are, and they're like, oh, you don't want to go, but then you go and you're like in mile 5 and you just like get that feeling where you just can't stop. I think that's the same thing with painters high, I guess. Where I think, getting out your palette and making sure your brushes are clean and stretching your canvas is like, oh, do I really want to do this? And then as soon as you do, you're like, that's why I'm doing this because of how much I want to. And so I think it can be hard to remember that it's what you're choosing to do it. But just, I guess, remembering that you're doing it for yourself because you enjoy it and trying not to get too caught up in sort of expectations. I think that everyone puts on themselves. I had to take like an Instagram break at the end of last year because I was just every single day I was scrolling and scrolling and being like, oh my God, I haven't made a new painting in a week and this person's posting every day. And I was just like, this isn't fun. So I just stopped. I was just like, you know what, signing out. And I think that actually that bred so much more creativity because it was just back to me and back to me wanting to create work. Um, Obviously it's great when you can share your work and people appreciate it and that gives you motivation in itself, like hearing people say they like a painting or they've read your blog post, it makes you feel so much better and want you to do more. But also it just comes down to the fact that you enjoy it, I think. And I think that's what motivates me, is knowing the feeling I get when I paint or when I create is just something that I can't really find anywhere else, so it's something I got to keep coming back to.
That's absolutely amazing. And do you think that your productivity has increased or decreased since you left university?
I think aside from the pandemic, increased. So the first year after uni, I think overall it was massively more productive, or maybe not more productive, but more like concentrated productivity. There was less sort of, I don't know, I was more sure of what I was doing. And so I was creating more work that I was happy with in shorter spaces of time. Whereas at uni, it was much more of sort of a long, slow process getting to the point where I wanted to be. But then since during the first lockdown was pretty good. I was lucky enough to be I was living at home with my parents and they set up like a home studio that I could use, which was great. So I was literally living in my studio, which was a bit chaotic, but it was great because I could literally roll out of bed every morning and paint. Um, but then I moved into a new flat. So I started the home studio, but obviously it was difficult to go to it because it was a different household. Um, and then I've moved again. So again, I've still got the home studio, but looking at setting up a new one. So I'm potentially moving that studio. So it's all got a bit chaotic, hence the lack of much work or blog posts. But yeah, I think having your own space helps massively, and obviously I'm very lucky to have that space to work in outside of uni because I know a lot of people obviously struggle to find studio space once they've left the comfort of uni. But I think because I found my sort of niche in my final year at university, it then just carried on and carried on like it was like a snowball. I couldn't stop. So I think definitely, aside from the pandemic, I've definitely been more productive.
Do you actually have any advice for artists who are currently studying at university in terms of what they should do? Like, what would you have liked to have known, like, before you left university?
Um, that's such a good question. There's so many, there's so many things. Um, you know what? Actually, I would have loved to know more about, and this is really, really silly, but this was like the biggest learning curve for me when I left uni and started like exhibiting and selling work. Packaging. No one talks to you about packaging a painting. No one ever told me how to like assemble a crate or properly package a frame or any of this stuff.
That's a really good answer, actually, because I have no idea how you package art.
No, well, this I literally watched YouTube tutorial after YouTube tutorial when I sold my first painting. I was like, "Oh my god, I've sold a painting." And I was like, "Oh no, I've got to get it to them." But yeah,
No, that's a good point,
I think
actually.
I think maybe more practical stuff like that, like very, or even just sort of, maybe I was very naive, but I don't think I ever even thought of that sort of stuff. But also probably just knowing to engage with art that wasn't necessarily related to mine as well. Like having an understanding of not only what was going on in contemporary art, but just different strands of the art world. I think you can get really boxed in as a student and just look at what you're interested in. But I was quite lucky. A lot of my close friends at uni were doing stuff that was completely different to me, like way off. And so we'd often share ideas or discuss stuff. So I found myself learning about completely new concepts that I had no idea about and never would have come across. So yeah, I think if I could go back to the beginning of uni and tell myself, I would have just been like, dive in earlier, just read everything, talk to any artist you can get hold of, and just soak it all in, really.
I think your point about talking to any artist you can get hold of, I think that's actually a really key piece of advice, because I think the way that the world is arranged is really funny, particularly the art world, because artists seem very unapproachable and very approachable at the same time. Like I know just from doing this, and obviously we're having this conversation now, like artists are very, very welcoming. They're very nice. Everyone I've spoken to so far are absolutely lovely. They've given me like a lot of insight and a lot of time, and I'm grateful. But but it's weird. It also seems like you can't approach them because they're artists, and
Yeah,
and I think that's pretty interesting that you would say that, because I think that's a really good piece of advice. Because they like just contact people. The worst thing they do is they'll ignore you. That's the worst thing that will happen.
exactly.
You know.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it, like, we were quite lucky to have my course. They arranged loads of like visiting artists, and we even had like people who had studied there years before come back and just say what they'd done since uni and stuff. And it was just so fascinating to hear about different people's different processes, different methods, like what they were interested in, what they thought they'd be doing versus what they were doing now. And yeah, it just widened the whole experience, I think, and got me out of the sort of like tunnel vision of must paint pictures of this, or so yeah, I think that's the case with a lot of stuff though. And yeah, it's interesting what you say about people thinking artists aren't approachable, because I've definitely thought that in the past, or felt nervous or intimidated by approaching people, and then you're literally just like, oh hi, I just want to say I love your work, I'd love to like ask you a few questions, and they're like, oh my god, hi, yeah.
That's
Literally.
literally me and every single message I send to everybody ever. I'm always like, even now before we did this, I'm always slightly nervous before I meet people, because you don't know how it's going to go.
Oh, I know, yeah.
Um, so, what are your thoughts on the current art industry? And did you find it hard to kind of find your own place?
um yeah, I definitely found it difficult to sort of settle into, not even a niche, but just sort of like finding somewhere to put myself out there. um I think the arts industry in general is just fascinating. Like I say, I wrote my dissertation on this, so I could talk for hours on just this one topic. But effectively, I think it still boils down so much to the value we place on sort of other people's opinions and this idea of fame or infamy. Um, and so it can feel really just unsettling. It's not a comfortable place to sort of try and situate yourself, and although I think it's sort of altered slightly in previous decades, I still think there's very much like the high art, and then sort of contemporary art, and then what people would say is like, I don't even know, sort of art with a function. So like, art in advertising or art in a music video or something like that. That's art that you're not really selling to the public, but people are viewing. So the whole structure of that, and like the notion of auction houses and paintings being sold for millions and millions of pounds is, I mean, it's difficult to get your head round. And at the same time, it's obviously something that any creative is in some way striving for. But at the same time, I think we feel a little bit like out if we became successful, which is ridiculous. Um, so yeah, I think it's really difficult to sort of navigate your way, especially when you're just starting out. I think I was very lucky coming out of uni. I really took advantage of all the sort of recent graduate opportunities. I just applied for every single competition, exhibition, award, everything. I was just like day after day sending out applications for everything. And I was lucky enough to get selected for a few. And that sort of opened doors in terms of people coming across my work, I guess, and getting people just like yourself. People would message me on Instagram and be like, "Oh, I saw you at such and such exhibition. I really like your stuff, and I'm actually organising an exhibition of recent graduates. Do you want to be in it?" And I was like, "Yeah." So I think that sort of helped me to make contacts, get to know people, and also understand how it works. But I definitely constantly still, every single time I do anything, be it an exhibition, something like this, just talking to another artist or posting on Instagram, I get massive imposter syndrome. I'm just like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing. They're not going to like this.
Really?
I'm going to say something stupid every single time I do anything. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. I think,
I think it's like an unspoken rule in the arts. It's like I think everybody feels that way, really. Like, okay, maybe not for Damien Haas, but other than that, everybody feels that way. And I think it's nice to hear people talk about it. I think more people need to talk about this though, because I think it's okay to feel like that. Like, of course, and it's natural.
exactly. And I think it is that sort of thing where you can't really teach that and you can't really prepare someone for what it'll be like to be part of like a collection of artists in a gallery or something like this until you experience it. I was shortlisted for the Ingram Collection Young Contemporary Talent Award just after I finished uni, and oh, which was amazing. And then I got there, and everyone else was like, were people that I had like admired their work, so they also knew graduates, but people I knew of, and I was like, oh my God, I'm here by accident. They've picked the wrong person. I was like, no, these are like artists. I'm a student. And it was only then I was suddenly like, wait a minute. They probably think exactly the same thing. They're all in the same situation. It's only because, you know, and I start to think, well, I shouldn't feel intimidated by being in a room full of people that I admire. I should feel honored that people I admire's work is put next to mine. Like, it's great. But it also is terrifying. Like, and then I did the Battersea Affordable Art Fair just before the first lockdown last year, and I'd never ever done an art fair, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I had to drive, so I was based in Suffolk at the time. I'm in Essex now, um, and the two paintings I was displaying were too big for my car, and to ship them to London and back like individual times was gonna be so expensive. So I had to hire a van, and I've never driven a van in my life. And I got this huge long wheelbase van and shoved my paintings in the back and just drove back and forth from London. And I was just like, this is what I'm doing. And in hindsight, there was definitely a better way I could have done that, or like hired a storage unit or something. But in my head, I was just like, right, the paintings need to be in London. I need to be in London. I've got to go to an art fair. So I just jumped in a van and went. Um, and I think that's the thing. You've just got to, in terms of figuring out how to be an artist professionally, you sort of just got to roll with it and just do anything.
But that's super amazing though, because the next time round you'll know what not to do and what to do, and you'll
Exactly.
be like, okay, there should be a better way. Now I'm going to sit down and figure this out. And I think what, more power to you for even having done that. You didn't have to do that. You could have been like, oh, they're not going to fit, forget it.
Yeah,
So yeah,
I think probably part of my, I don't want to call it success, but part of the luck and like the good experience I've had is because I probably haven't thought stuff through enough when I've done stuff. So I like apply to exhibitions with like a 2 meter squared painting. And the exhibition's in like Glasgow, and I'll just be like, yeah, they'll like this. And then they're like, oh, we'd love to show that. And I'm like, oh crap, I've got to get to Scotland with this painting. And it's just like, so I think probably my spontaneity or lack of planning maybe works in my favor in that respect.
I think that tells me that you need to be more confident in your work. That's what that tells me. So do you feel like you are part of? It might be a premature question to ask you though, actually, but do you feel like you're part of a larger art community at the moment?
Um, that's a difficult one. I think I definitely feel part of the sort of global and national art community, as in I feel like an artist, but only because I call myself an artist and I make art, not necessarily because I feel that sort of wider inclusion. But I think again that comes a lot down to the global circumstance at the moment, because there hasn't been the opportunity to go to exhibitions, to go to talks, and experience stuff firsthand like we normally would. But I think there's a sort of comfort in that collective sort of distance as well. I definitely felt when I first graduated, there was a real sort of little bubble of all of us new graduates who were all applying for the same opportunities and all this sort of thing, and we were all sort of in it together. And I think that bubble's still there, but I think we're all just caught up in so much other stuff at the moment. So yeah, I think it's really difficult to answer. I think being an artist can be quite a sort of solitary experience if you want it to be, but also if you forget to sort of engage with the wider art community. I think things like Instagram and social media are such a great tool, especially now for artists, because it just opens up so many opportunities and dialogue. Like talking to you, it has been so brilliant, and like being able to share my work with you and do these discussions, and it almost like reminds me, it comes back to what we were talking about with motivation. Even doing this right now, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to paint. I'm
Oh,
like,
good. No, I'm really glad.
yeah,
Generally, I'm really good about that.
yeah,
And I
so
hope
yeah,
that, this talk and like anything I do with like kind of inspires other people to be that way. It's about motivation and kind of just knowing that you have to keep creating no matter what. Um,
exactly. Yeah, and I think there's definitely that sort of like unspoken understanding between creatives when you meet someone else who, even like, people doing something completely different, um, you can be like, oh, what do you do? And they, or they could be like, oh, I do like punk rock knitting. And I could be like, I have no idea what that is, but that sounds awesome. And I would tell them about my work and they'd be like, that doesn't sound like me. But there's this sort of, there's a community built within this idea of, let's say, being a creative. And I think there's that understanding between people who are in a similar situation or have been in a similar situation. Let's say my dad was an artist slash ceramicist, and I think it's really nice for him now seeing me go through like the studying, trying to be an artist, exhibiting, and him sort of reminiscing about, oh, I remember when I was an art student, all this sort of stuff. So there's sort of that connection of, you know, a sort of empathy, or being able to put themselves in your situation and understand it.
Absolutely. I think that's what connects people. That's what's going to help you. And actually, one of the things I've learned from doing these interviews so far is connections are extremely important. And so, connect yourself with as many people as you can, not just to get things from them, but just because you never know whose work you'll see that you like that you can tie together. Like for me, for instance, there's quite a lot of artists I've interviewed and I just obviously feature. And I see there's similarities in their work, and I'm like, they'll be so good to exhibit together or just to work together. So I like this idea of connecting people and just kind of just showcasing like great art to people. It's what I love doing. So COVID-19, I want to talk a bit about that. Like, how has that actually affected you and your practice? And has it been a positive or negative?
Um, it's been a weird one. I think, like I touched on briefly before, it's been disruptive in the case of the sort of practicalities and logistics of creating work, in terms of having somewhere to work, being able to access that place to work, getting materials, having enough money to buy materials, not being able to exhibit, that sort of thing. So it's definitely been, I think, disheartening is probably the word I would use, in terms of, not specifically for me. I think I'm in a very lucky situation where um, I work, so I have money to sort of finance that. I'm not relying on sales to be able to live, so I didn't have to worry about that aspect, which obviously some people are in a situation where it literally just, you know,
I can't.
yeah, turned everything upside down. So it was more the sort of, like I say, I think disheartening aspect where I felt like it was really going to throw a spanner in the works for my career as an artist, because I felt like that was the year that was supposed to be, I'd graduated, I'd had a bit of a kickstart, I'd done some exhibiting, I'd made loads of nice connections. People were starting to talk about solo exhibitions and, oh, we'd love to do this with this person. Oh, you'd be great for this. And it was like, yeah, it's all going to happen this year. It's going to be this big year, 2020. And then obviously it wasn't. So I think it was a bit of a knock. But then there was also something quite comforting about knowing that everyone was kind of in the same boat. And it definitely, well, to start with, in all honesty, it completely changed my plan for the next couple of years. I was supposed to be moving to London to start a non-arts based but very exciting job, which all just fell through because of the pandemic, obviously. Um, so I hadn't been planning on doing a master's yet. I didn't really know what I was going to do other than sort of starting this job and seeing what happened in terms of with art. It was going to be put on the sidelines a bit, and then during the first lockdown, yeah, during the first lockdown, like I say, I was lucky enough to have access to a home studio, and I just started making, trying stuff out. got involved with a few like online exhibitions with some people. And I think it's sort of this is when I actually first started doing the embroidery pieces. So that definitely was like a great thing to come out of the pandemic. And like I say, and now obviously going off to do my masters is going to be awesome. But I think it definitely it changed my mind about a lot of stuff, but it also maybe focused me on knowing that I did want to pursue this. Um, so yeah, it's been a bit of a weird one. It's obviously been like crap. It was really disheartening and sort of worrying at first, but then I think it was almost it gave me the headspace to actually decide more stuff and maybe like reevaluate plans and reevaluate works. I mean, yeah, like I say with the embroidery stuff, I don't think I not ever, but I definitely wouldn't have created the embroidery works I have and sort of pursued that had I not been in lockdown. So I think it sort of made me readdress my process and explore other ways of working rather than just maybe becoming almost mechanical and creating paintings. I think when you're sort of in a structured routine, I was very much finding myself, this is how I make a painting, this is how I mix my paint, this is how I do this. And then when there was nothing else to do, it was like, oh, well, what if I made a painting, but it was made of thread?
That's a perfect segue into your work. That's a perfect entryway to talk about it. So actually, please talk about the embroidery. So can you just talk a bit about it? Talk about and I know you just touched upon it, but talk a bit about how, where did the thought process come from, and how did you, how were you like, yeah, okay, this is what I want to do. This is cool. This is a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, to start with, I've always enjoyed embroidery and I've always sort of done a little bit of sewing and stuff here and there, but I never really connected it to the idea of it being fine art. I always saw it more of like an arts and craft thing or a
Yeah,
practical thing. And then during during lockdown, first time around, um, like I say, I was
round
sort
one.
of yeah, round one. I was living at home with my parents and basically living in my studio was like my childhood bedroom, so I was sort of effectively living in my studio. That's how I say it to sound glamorous, not just I moved back home. Um, and so I was quite, although I was lucky to have space, I was quite limited on space. And so a lot of my paintings normally are quite large, or at least sort of there's a lot going on at once. So I work in quite a sort of spread out manner. So within a month or two of lockdown, I very much had run out of studio space to be creating big paintings. So I was doing a lot more sketching, a lot more smaller works, a lot more sort of digital stuff as well. Um, and just happening to have some embroidery thread lying around because that's the sort of person I am who just has clutter. Um, and I just thought, oh, it'd be really interesting to make these small, intricate portraits. And then it was like, oh well, they don't have to be paint if they're going to be a different size and everything else. And I had a load of like vintage Playboy magazines and Mayfair and all sorts of stuff that I had used um, just after I'd graduated. Actually, I did a whole series on like pornography and sort of using pornographic imagery, but recontextualizing it and reframing it and cropping it and all sorts. So I had these magazines littering my studio, and I thought, well, it's interesting. I began to really think about like the scale of the body and the figure, and then condensed into these magazines, and how it's sort of this translation between objectification and sort of voyeurism in pornography, and then also in terms of size. So I was really interested in keeping the images sort of to the size they were in the magazine. So I was like, oh well, I'll just trace them, and then I was like, wait a minute, I can literally embroider onto these images. So I just started sort of playing around with it, and randomly, it was all just sort of like a happy accident. I had some uh, old typed off typewriter pages from when my one of my parents had been doing a civil service training course when they were like in their 20s, and just had these like scraps of paper from it like in the attic or something. And obviously it was lockdown, everyone was having a clear out. And my parents are great at just being like, oh, I've got some basically rubbish. Do you want to make art out of it? And I'm like, yeah. Um, and as I was reading these, it was all these pages about like being a typist or being a secretary and about word counts and like attention to detail and all this sort of stuff. And it seemed really appropriate to be putting like um a method that was sort of, handcrafted and delicate and precise, and also more traditionally a feminine practice of sewing onto this sort of harsh black and white typed paper that was all about, being meticulous and industrious and all this sort of stuff. Um, so yeah, it just sort of seemed like, oh well, this seems to have some meaning and it seems to be working. So I literally just started making these small embroidered portraits of the women from um, these magazines, but using more the sort of less explicit um, poses or compositions, and ended up with these sort of a handful to start with of small, colourful portraits in thread. Um, and yeah, and they just, I mean, people were just like, wow, these are amazing. And I was like, thank you. I like them too. And it really got me thinking more about the actual context behind how I'm making these works. My paintings have always been more about the finished work, whereas with the embroideries, I started thinking a lot more about what I was physically doing. And then the contrast as well between this, like with the photograph, even in print, there's like that immediacy, or at least everyone thinks there is. Everyone's like, oh, you can just snap a picture on your iPhone. Whereas in actual fact, even for Playboy, they're spending thousands of pounds or dollars and so much time on getting the perfect shoot and the lighting and everything else, all for this one image that, especially in the context of a porn mag, is going to be very much a sort of instantaneous, like visual experience. So then converting that to something that takes hours to physically make by hand, I just like that sort of dichotomy of the body being something that's so fleeting, especially the female nude being something that's just like at a glance, but also so accessible, to then making something so delicate and completely unique. Like I could never recreate one of those. So I just love that sort of the intricacy of the original medium and then what I did with it, and then making something that didn't really look like either of those and no one really knew the significance. So yeah, and I just sort of carried on making them throughout the first lockdown. Um, and yeah, I'm actually working on a new series at the moment of embroidery works that's more about I'm doing sort of silhouette pieces. So they're just blocks and sort of overlapping shapes of bodies. So again, this whole notion that you don't necessarily immediately know it's a figure, and then the sort of blocks of color make it less figurative, but also the idea that obviously the time spent with that image in the making process is supposed to be sort of more, has more staying power than just like a photograph, or than like a photograph on social media that you just scroll past. So yeah, I'm not quite sure where it's going at, but that's what I'm working on at the moment.
That's so interesting. I love hearing you talk about your work. You talk about it very, very well, like very
Thank
well. Um, and it gives it's kind of almost annoying because it gives me like a lot of questions I can ask you. I'm trying to think where to go. I'm just like where to go to next. So let me just rearrange my thoughts for a second, which is cool. And I actually really wanted to ask you about what they were actually sewn onto, because I was thinking like there's got to be a reason you chose that particular particular background, because it wouldn't just be, oh, I mean, obviously it was just a bit like, oh, these I've got these here, I'll use them, but
Yeah, well, it kind of was. So it literally was. I just grabbed the nearest piece of paper to like line up and was about to trace it. And then I was like, what is this? Why has it got writing on it? And I was reading it and I was like, this is freaky. And this is going to be, I was like, this is going to be so cool. The link with this. And then I was like searching for more pages of it. I was like, where can I get more? And yeah, so it wasn't planned at first, but it just, it became this, yeah, almost like a little inside joke I had with myself about the relevance of it. And because a lot of people, I don't think, read it, they just sort of, see, oh, it's image on text and that's like aesthetically pleasing, which at first obviously that was my thought as well, so there's nothing wrong with that. But afterwards I was almost like trying to find pages with certain phrases on or something like that to sort of line up. But
perhaps
yeah.
you should buy a typewriter and type them up yourself.
But to be fair, I actually do have a typewriter.
You should do it then. Like, what? That's perfect.
Yeah,
Or yeah, that's perfect. Like, yeah, that's so cool. And
yeah,
actually, that's really
celebration, a poet or
like
something.
that fascinates me because for me personally, I can see it going into a lot of different directions. So I can see, you're doing really interesting collages and interesting text, working with like typography. But yeah, because I think it was exciting. That's what I think it is. I think it's also really, really interesting to consider how the constraints you had of being in that small space has led you to do work that you wouldn't have thought you were going to be doing.
Yeah,
And I think that's a good example to anybody and everybody of how you don't have to let your constraints constrain you so much. You have to work with what you have, and don't be afraid to try new things, and don't be afraid to be like, oh, this might work, this might not work. Like, who knows? Like, that's the whole process of art, is that you try things.
I think that sort of um emphasizes as well the importance of sort of experimentation as an artist. Like no matter what level you're at, whether you're still studying, whether you've been an artist for 50 years and you're in the Tate, there's no harm in being like, okay, maybe not if you're in the Tate because you're probably fine, but there's no
Uh,
harm in being like, oh, I want to try like making a paper mache arm today. That might become your
mm,
best work ever, or just something that leads on to something else.
it's like thinking about art not just on a wall, not just in a gallery space, in everyday life, on everyday life. And I think sometimes art becomes diluted with the internet and the accessibility. And I've actually, but just before we did this, I was watching a YouTube video about art theft. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So like, it's on my mind. But like, I'll ask this question now. I was going to ask you later, but I'll ask you this question, then we'll come back to your work in a minute. But do you think that the value of art has increased or decreased in current times?
That is such a tricky question. I think, oh, I don't know, because I don't know whether to be like philosophical about it. I think people have maybe the like appreciation has increased in terms of people wanting to be around art. But I think with any industry, I think as accessibility grows, you are opening the door to lower quality, higher volume. But then I don't know where the idea of quality comes from with art. So I think it's really difficult to say. And I think it comes back to the whole thing with the art industry being so divided into like high art and the rest, in that the huge art houses and have almost the pandemic has almost not affected them because they're almost above the reaches of the impact of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does.
The like the one percenters where this
Yeah.
is just nothing to them. So I think in that respect, it's almost not altered the value in terms of, or not changed value in terms of like finance, but potentially changed almost like the emotional value of art. That sounds way too like philosophical, but I think that's kind of what I mean. I think people are maybe appreciating art more now, or appreciating the impact of art more, but not necessarily wanting to buy it.
Yeah, that
I
that's a great answer. That's an absolutely great answer.
confused myself for that answer, but I think that's what I mean. Yeah. So I think in part yes, and in part no.
So what are your kind of thoughts and opinions upon kind of the thing about art is that you have to kind of put yourself in a box without trying to put yourself in a box? Like, how do you navigate that?
I think it's really difficult because I think, like with anything, once you've been once you define your own work or become defined through somebody else or some collaboration or whatever else, it's very difficult to pursue other things without feeling like you're letting the side down. um and I think it's quite hard to choose what you want to do in advance, almost, and I think there's almost that expectation that you should, whereas actually it's more interesting to see stuff progress completely differently. One of my favorite artists of all time is Andrew Salgado, and
Absolutely. I
I
love
love
his
him.
work. I love his work.
And I remember his really early works in like, I say really early works, I mean when I first sort of came across his work in like, I don't know, 2010, and I adored his work then. But when you look at the comparison to what he was making when he just left, when he was just starting out, and to now, and they're completely different in terms of like style and process and everything else. And I just think like it's so brilliant that he chose to do stuff a little bit differently. Like even his floral works are so different to what he was making when like the first time I went to see one of his exhibitions, but they're absolutely stunning. And I just worry that people are potentially too eager to put themselves in boxes and be a bit like they were at my uni where they ask you, you know, are you a painter or are you a sculptor? It's like, well, what if I'm both? What if I'm neither? You know, what if I want to try both? What if I actually want to do doodles on napkins? I mean, you know, I think in the current art market and industry, as with most industries these days, a lot to do with because of like the impact of social media, but I think people are desperate to find their USP and their niche and where they fit into the big tapestry of the world. And I think the eagerness to do that early can often stunt the creative process in terms of, you know, what you might have explored next. Like say, I might never have done tiny embroideries of porn magazines if there hadn't been a global pandemic, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say. Um, but I think if I'd boxed myself in and said, no, I'm just a painter, I can't work with thread because I'm a painter, I can only work with paint, then I would have neglected something I wanted to explore and something that people have enjoyed and I've enjoyed making. So I think it's important for, I think it's important to be able to define your work, but rather than defining what it is physically or aesthetically, you know, rather than me saying, I'm a painter and I make works that look like this, it's more interesting for me to say, I'm an artist and I'm interested in the body and context and the value and commodity of art and this sort of thing. It's more interesting to know what drives somebody and what they find interesting, and then almost seeing that through the lens of their art rather than just saying, oh, that's the guy that draws stickmen, because they might not want to draw stickmen.
Like you kind of define your work by the themes they explore as opposed to the subject it explores,
Yeah, absolutely.
even though they're quite closely linked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's and that's great, and I think that's super interesting, and I think there is so much to talk about in your work. Just looking at your work firstly, but secondly going through your blog especially, there's just so much to talk about. So the first place I want to start is your very, very interesting two-word exercise. Can you talk a bit about that, about kind of like where you discovered that idea from, and how you've used it for your work?
So basically the concept was I think it stemmed from when I was at uni, and especially when you introduce yourself and people say, "Oh, what are you doing?" You say, "Oh, I'm a student." They say, "Oh, what are you studying?" "I'm studying fine art." And they go, "Oh, what art do you do?" And that question is exciting, but also absolutely terrifying, especially when you're still figuring out, because you're suddenly like trying to garble about what you make and why you make it, who you're inspired by, where you want to go with it, what you're planning on doing, like whether you prefer charcoal or pen. And it's like this whole explosion of thought where you're trying to tell somebody what you make and make them interested in it without sounding like a mad person. So basically, it was this whole idea that the best way to define anything is just to start with two words. So if I was to say, like, how would you describe a banana? You'd be like, well, it's a fruit and it's yellow. And don't get into the whole, tangent on anything else. It's that simple. It's just find two words that are important to the concept. So I think this is when I was probably having a bit of like a who am I? What am I doing? What does my art mean moment? And I was just it it made me think so much more clearly about how I could simplify the process down to what's really important. So this was where it links perfectly back to what we were just talking about putting yourself into a box and trying to think more about the wider concept of a work rather than just like the appearance or the medium. So I ended up trying to sort of look at my practice and think what the key parts of it were and how I could harness those rather than getting caught up in, say, I went through this, well, not awful phase. It was great, but it was also really stunting where I got really obsessed with the like turquoise and blue tones. So every time I'd start painting, I'd mix these colors up, and they wouldn't be the right colors for the painting, and so the painting wouldn't work, and I'd get really annoyed, and I'd be like, why? And then I was like, stop using blue for everything. So I think doing this exercise of trying to just find two things, two words to define, my practice helped me to sort of take a little step back and sort of readdress where I was coming from, I think, yeah.
And do you have any examples of the two words used to describe your work?
Oh, I think I did. Yes, so there were a few on the blog. The first one was colourful porn, which was one of my favourites. But I think there was a really good one about, oh, the reposition perspective. I like the repositioning bit of that. Um, but yeah, I think it changes every day though, and I think it always will. But I think that's sort of the fun bit, is that, maybe it's something for artists to do every couple of months, is just to sort of go, oh, am I still making recontextualized portraits, or am I now making colorful blocks? This is the where it will go, is how that it's a nice way to almost track your evolution of an idea, is to pinpoint it down to just two key words.
Yeah, I thought it was super interesting. And
Mm.
because I think about your work is that your work's abstract in more ways than one. It's so hard for an artist to talk about what they do, because they do so many different things at once. Your work is not just about one thing, because you say it's about the body, but the next person might see it as something completely different. The whole idea of boxing yourself in, I guess, is just for you to have a touchstone and have a reference as to where you would like your work to be placed, but also knowing that it's not set in stone.
Yeah, it's almost
It's
like elevator pitch as well, I
yeah.
think, with like that quick way of saying what kind of thing you're doing, but being able to sort of extrapolate on it. And especially with being an emerging artist and like applying for things, you're so often asked to be like, describe your practice in 200 words. And it's like, well, that's not possible. So yeah, I definitely think it's good to have that, yeah, that like jumping off point from, to be able to say, well, this is what I do, but let me expand on that.
But it must be quite hard as well, though, just because as an artist, the whole point of you creating visual work is that you don't have to necessarily talk about it because
Yeah.
it's visual. But if you don't talk about your work, you might not understand what you're doing.
A lot of artists, obviously, you don't want to like tell people what to think about your work, because that would just destroy the point. You want people to make their own opinions, but at the same time you almost not want to like point people in the right direction. But obviously, it's like when you go to a gallery, you look at the pieces and then you probably read the little blurb just to be like, oh yeah, I thought it might be about that. But at the same time, you wouldn't want like a 3-page essay on each painting to be like, you will think this is about this. So yeah, it's I think it's a part of sort of, you want to discuss what your work is discussing without saying to people, here's this picture and this means this. And if you say it means something else, you're wrong. Like, there shouldn't be a right and a wrong answer, because art is so subjective. But at the same time, obviously, your work is a development of your own interest and your own perspective. So it makes sense to give that dialogue to the people who are viewing your work.
So how do you try to make sure that there's enough context for your work when people see it, especially online?
That's a very good question. I think it can be difficult because so much of viewing art online has become so instantaneous. Um, and like I say, especially with Instagram and stuff, like it's a great platform, but you can feel a little bit like a drop in the ocean. Um, and so I think it comes down to a lot of sort of consistency in, I don't know actually if that's the word. I was going to say consistency in what you're making and putting out there, but then I guess that sort of comes back to the whole thing of being boxed in. I think it's really difficult, and I think it relies a lot on the participation of who's viewing your work to want to learn a little bit more. And taking it to back to Instagram, if someone was to see one of my paintings and think, oh, I like that because it's figurative, but then they went onto my page or my website and saw a load of works that weren't, they might be a bit like, oh. Whereas the sort of, I think the dialogue around my work helps to link pieces that wouldn't necessarily be linkable. It can be really hard because you don't want to be like stuffing stuff down people's throats and saying, look at my work, it's about this. But at the same time, you don't want people to just flip past it or not be interested. And that's one thing I think that's quite difficult with viewing work digitally, is obviously you don't get the same sort of experience as viewing work in person. Um, Even if the work like physically looks the same, say it's a digital image, it's just that I think the experience of viewing it in the place that it was intended to be viewed, so You know, if I'd made a painting with the intention of putting it on a gallery wall, but you're viewing it as a thumbnail on Instagram, it's not necessarily going to have the same effect. And so the dialogue then helps to sort of resituate my intention within the way it's being received. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's a minefield because, and like you say, I get so many people say to me, like, "Oh, I love that you're doing work that's about this," and I'm like, "Oh, I didn't really think my work was about that, but okay, cool, yeah." And similarly, I'll say to people, "Oh, yeah, I'm interested in this," and they'll be like, "Oh, I don't get that at all," and you're like, "Okay, cool." So, yeah, it's definitely difficult to sort of have a running dialogue that sits well with everybody.
I'm probably gonna be one of them people in a minute because I've got so one of the themes that I get from your work. Let me put that out there.
Mhm.
That I get from your work is this, and actually something that I was reading on one of your blog posts, and this is why your blog posts are fascinating, just not for me to read just as an outsider, but also because I understand how important it is to talk about your own work and write about your work and reflect upon your own work, and it's cool. So one of the themes that I really got from your work was the idea of detachment.
Mm,
And it was something that was super interesting that I didn't think about when I first initially looked at your work, but when I read that blog post about the cropping, which is something we should talk about as well, it really made me think about your work. And I've have it written here. As cool, yeah, but the ideas of representation and the way in which art is real. Could you talk bit about realism in your work? Because your work isn't necessarily real, but it also is.
mm. Yeah, definitely. So the whole idea of the sort of detachment is really interesting that you bring up because that's definitely like um I think that's definitely something I consider a lot when I'm creating my work, but also I consider a lot when I'm viewing other people's work. I find it really interesting to think about. There's a great quote by someone who I can't remember who it's by, so I'll just gloss over that. But it's something like art makes everything, what is it? No, yeah, art makes everything an object. Like not only physically, obviously, you know, if you paint something, the painting itself is object, but it makes the subject an object. And that's something I always think about with my own work and with other people's, is this whole notion that by recreating something or creating something that doesn't exist on a canvas or out of clay or however you want to produce it, you are literally like appropriating something real and making it real but in a different sense. So that's where sort of like the crop almost helped me to uh not justify, but like to make peace with the idea that I was almost contributing to the objectification of bodies. So I think that was my like way of processing that. Um, and then on top of that, the whole aspect of realism, it's that another way of detaching the concept that this is a person, not necessarily in a bad way. I think my method of doing it almost. So when I'm painting something, either in either in the colors I use or the like I often do this sort of I often call it stylization because just I haven't really come up with a better word for it, but it's effectively just sort of blocking in an image, um, and yeah, stylizing it, I guess. And I think the reason I wanted to do that is I was trying to sort of make the distinction between it being an image, a painted image of a person, and it being a person. And I think there's a real sort of contrast between that when you see like these hyper realistic portraits that almost, you know, become photographs. It's a really different experience to viewing like a figurative drawing that's really expressionist, or you know, like some of Matisse's work um, are so they're so obviously figurative, and everyone appreciates that they are, but they look nothing like people. And there's that whole like recognizability, but also detachment from being a person and viewing something that's clearly not realistically a person, but knowing it's a person, and that almost it's like it's like the empathy, it's putting yourself into the work. The detachment is important because it almost highlights, by making something so clearly not a realistic painting of a body, but either visually or subconsciously knowing that it is a body, makes you realize your own detachment from like the human lived experience of having a body, if that makes sense. Because so often we don't think about our own bodies and how they look and how they function in a way that's objective. You know, a lot of the time, especially for women, when we talk about like beauty cultures where I'm going to go, you know, most of the time when I look at my body, it's often, oh, these jeans didn't do up, oh, I've got a weird bit of skin there, oh, that freckle's a bit odd. Or on the flip side, oh, my hair's actually sitting nicely today, oh, I quite like how my leg looks at that angle or whatever else. But there's never just like a, oh, that's my arm, you know. There's this weird, almost like out of body, excuse the pun, experience of being inside your body and viewing it. And I think that same thing happens when we're looking at a painting or a sculpture of a body, knowing that it's a body, but knowing that it's not a real body. I don't know
That's
if any of that made sense.
no, that made absolute sense. I think that's like, this is why your work's so fascinating, because that makes perfect sense. And actually, and the idea of a painting something and becomes an object is something I've never ever thought about. And it works out so well in context to your work, because you're talking about the female body, and obviously we live in a society where it is objectified, and it is put to a very high standard, very unrealistic high standard, and there's a lot of discourse around it, both good and bad. And where does your work fit into that discourse of standards of beauty and, yeah, just the wider general discourse?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, I completely agree. Like, it's so strange to be, I think, be a female artist trying to paint often female bodies without contributing to um, a sort of patriarchal dialogue around that, which was something I used to really not like get annoyed at, but sort of question. I'd be like, wait, am I the problem? um, but yeah, I think because there's so much discussion around female beauty and female bodies, like you say, for good and bad, especially in contemporary society, it's difficult to um, sort of place myself among that without either just becoming a sort of uh, another generic voice, or trying to be like, I am the gospel on this. And I think, and something I struggled with, well, not struggled with, but something I started to consider last year was as well the fact that I'm trying to represent bodies that are not necessarily relatable to me in some instances. When I first started off working with the figure, I was really interested in looking at diversity and sort of using the crop to remove the fact that it's a body entirely, and so focusing on the fact that it should just be about the colours and shapes and tones, which is still definitely part of my work. But then I felt that doing that as, a white, middle class, able bodied, slim-ish woman, it's not really my place to be having a dialogue around, like fat activism or ableism or race. That's not where, I don't have the authority to do that. And so it would be difficult for me to be making work that's trying to comment on, like I say, like body inclusivity, because I live in a body that, as a standard, society accepts. So it's difficult for me to place that where I can, like I say, I shouldn't be the voice of authority on that. So I started to consider that a lot and placing that within the standards of beauty. And so I think my work sits more not to make a point about beauty standards or to sort of make an argument either way, but I just hope that my work can almost encourage dialogue about their existence, about the whole idea of objectification, because I think although everyone's aware of it and we all do it and we all are subject to it and everything else, it is still kind of like taboo. It's still kind of a bit like awkward to talk about. And so I think by having work that's sort of like a bit uncomfortable when you realize that is really interesting, and seeing people's reactions. Like, it was at my degree show after my BA, just putting up work that some of it was like a bit explicit, some of it wasn't, but it was all bodies, and seeing people come in and sort of go, oh, okay, and then be like, oh, is it all right that I'm looking at that though? Once they've realized that that's a butt or that's an elbow or whatever else. And it's sort of seeing the reaction there where people suddenly, they see themselves seeing a body, and because they don't know whose body it is or what the origin is, what the context is, there's this sort of uncomfortability. And I think that's where I would sit myself in terms of that sort of huge discussion around the body, and especially the female body, is just hoping that people realize they're like realize themselves being both the voyeur and the object.
I think that's like such a good insight into your work because I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, I wouldn't say that's not what it's about personally, but for me, like, yeah, that's cool. I can totally see that, but that's not necessarily the vibes I would get from it viewing it myself. Maybe in person I would, but like not from viewing it currently. And I think that's super interesting because your work, then that means then your work is actually less about the nude itself and more about the experience, the human condition and the experience of being a human.
Yeah, I think as well, to be honest, it's also how my understanding of my work has developed as I've continued with it. So, like some of it when I first started out was much more about like objectification and sort of the feminist narrative on the nude. But I think yeah, it's not that it's not those things, but I think I view it much more as just like a catalyst for a realization that that's what's happening almost. So it's almost like lighting a match to show someone fire. It's sort of saying, hey, you know how you're looking at this painting? Well, that's porn and that's objectification and that's a beauty standard. And then people are like, oh, not like I'm saying, I'm not trying to say any of these things are, I'm not trying to like say pornography is bad or anything like this,
Yeah,
but
of
it's
course.
it's this sort of dialogue of saying, oh, you know that thing that you just don't really think about much. Maybe have a think about that, I guess.
I guess that's one of the purposes of art. Do you ever worry about people taking your work out of context in the wrong way?
Um, I think I worry about it in the sense that I think I often wonder, oh, will people like get it? But I think my work is able to be interpreted in so many ways that I don't think it could be taken out of context in a way that's so far away from what I'm trying to do that it would be sort of, offensive or anything. And
Oh
that's
no, I meant more in the sense of like, oh, it's just another nude. Like, oh, move on.
oh yeah. And then I think similarly, I think I do often think, oh, people will just think I'm painting a nude because people paint nudes. But then I think, well, if they think that, that's kind of fine. Like,
I guess, yeah, that's I guess, and actually, this was a question I was meant to ask you earlier. So actually, now's a good time to ask you. So, like, how do you kind of, yeah, because okay, so because obviously your work is like you work with nudes, and there's plenty of other artists that work with nudes. Like, how do you kind of separate yourself from the overabundance of art, like the oversaturation of art, and like discourse and kind of ideology? Like, how do you try to make sure that you're trying to have your own original voice?
um, I think that's a great question. I think it's something that's really difficult to pinpoint. Um, because I think I mean, I definitely think my art, but almost every artist I know has, one or two other artists that are like key influences for them. Not in the sense that like they're copying their work, but they're the people they're referencing subconsciously when they're
Yeah,
creating. And so I think it's just a case of sort of consistently coming back to what I'm interested in. So coming back to this notion of the context of the figure and the sort of like understanding of, like we say, the human inhabitation of a body and all this sort of thing. I think it's just reminding myself that when I'm making work and trying not to think too much about the aesthetic of a piece when I'm making it, which I think is quite unusual in considering nudes because of the sort of, especially at the moment, there is a massive saturation of um sort of nude art. We're seeing a real influx at the moment. It's very trendy, the sort of single line. I mean,
yeah.
this sort of stuff that's on my wall behind me, which is obviously I like it, so that's I have no complaints. But yeah, the figurative work, like say the single line drawing stuff, which is really trendy at the moment, and that's awesome. But yeah, it is definitely difficult to then see yourself obviously in comparison to those sort of artworks and try and put yourself aside them without being sucked into a certain style or a certain design that isn't yours. Um, but yeah, I think with mine, like I say, I'm quite stuck with sort of two or three other artists who I really love, and so their work is always like really inspiring when I see new stuff. But also, I try not to compare too much and focus more on the process. Like I say, like we were talking about earlier with putting yourself in a box. I think if I think too much about if I think too much about what a painting is going to look like while I'm painting it, it will be terrible. Whereas if I just
That's
paint
interesting.
it, which doesn't really make sense as an artist, but I think if I just paint and don't try and plan it too much and focus on this idea I have of like repositioning that image that I've started with, it's sort of an organic process where it becomes what it ends up as rather than me planning it so much. Um,
So my next question for you really would be is that do you like being compared to the artists?
um, I think in some ways, it for the most part, yes. Like it's always a big compliment when someone can say, "Oh, your work reminds me of so and so," or "Oh, I know somebody that does a really similar thing that I think you'll like their work." Because I think it's always a comfort to sort of know that what you're doing is relevant enough that it can be linked to someone else. Obviously, you never want to hear like, "Oh, you've copied that off so and so," because then you're like, "Crap, have I accidentally plagiarized?" Um, but yeah, I love it when people say, "Oh, your work really reminds me of this," or "Oh, do you know this artist?" or "Oh, you must have been interested in such and such." Um, but also it can be sort of worrying, like you say, that it comes back to the whole thing of to trying to be original and knowing that you're doing something original when there are so many artists out there. Um, it's like the whole with musicians only having a set number of notes to work with. In the same sense, artists only have a much larger number, but there's only so many concepts and things you can
Yeah,
approach through art. Although those things may be infinite, it's unlikely that every single person who's creating work is going to come up with a totally original idea. So
absolutely.
you're obviously going to be influenced by other people, and by proxy, you're then going to be compared to other people or put aside other people and said, "Oh, your work's similar." But I think there's a sort of joy in that because you see how other people are approaching a similar subject or how other people are using a similar technique. And it's often something that leads you to something else in your work. So it's the concept is daunting, but in practice it actually tends to be quite comforting to know that what you're doing is relatable, and also that your work is able to branch out because you know in all my time and in everyone else I know, I've never met another figurative artist who makes work exactly the same. There are people that
Oh yeah,
do
of
similar
course not.
things. So it's almost nice to know that even if you all started out with the same idea, everyone went in different directions.
Absolutely, and that's the nature. Like everybody approaches their art very differently. Even if it's you're right, even if it's
Exactly.
the same subject, like absolutely. And I can think of, and this is no slight to you, but I can think of at least a good, 5 artists who I think your work would work really well in a show, like a theme show, and I think that'd be really cool. And
Mhm.
so let's talk about painting. What initiates a painting for you?
Um, to be fair, it's quite a number of things. It can often just be I'll see an image or a pose or a certain sort of something in it's often with imagery rather than in person. But I'll often just see something that I think is interesting or has an interesting composition. Um, Often I'll just be flicking through a magazine, or I had one recently where I paused a program on TV and the person had like turned but hadn't taken their head with them yet. And there was this lovely, almost like ballerina-esque pose. And I was like, oh my God, that would be cool as a painting. And so I like quickly drew like a sketch of it. Um, but often, yeah, it will just be the visual of a figure that will just strike me for either, like say, the pose or something is interesting. And then it's a case of sort of taking that imagery, like say if it's in a magazine, I'll literally tear out the page and scan it into my computer, and then I'll play around with different crops of it. Or if it's on my phone, I'll like screenshot it and manipulate it. Like I have a folder on my phone that's literally thousands and thousands and thousands of screenshots. A lot of which I've never even like revisited, but sometimes I will. If I'm stuck for a painting, I'll be like, oh, I'll just go in the screenshot folder. And it just comes down to this sort of pinpointing an interesting angle or shape that the body has made, or an interesting pose. With the work that I did with the pornographic imagery, that was much more about almost, or let's say I got a load of like vintage or archival porn mags and basically just rifled through them and took any that was sort of compositionally effective, or yeah, just sort of playing around with stuff that works. I have the little like you had at primary school, the little frames what are they called? The little like square cutouts that you place over an image and move it around. So I have like one of them that I'll just play around with on stuff. Um, and yeah, and I think it just develops from there. The sort of idea of once I find an image that I think is going to be interesting, or an image that is different, I am often really drawn to like when uh companies do like campaigns with like inclusivity and stuff, which was always a bit sort of, oh, you've just cast that person because they're like the token of a set, you know.
Yeah.
I always found those images really interesting because it was then almost like this sort of doctored view of a demographic of society.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in those sort of shots as well. So there's always this thing of basically just like saving images from, yeah, like modeling campaigns, from like stills from movies and TV shows and the TV Guide and stuff like this. And then yeah, sometimes sourcing magazines. I did a whole series of um works from classical nude paintings when I was at uni. So looking at sort of crops of them. But yeah, it always comes back to the source image. A lot of people ask me if I work from life, and I do love working from life, but it doesn't have the same sort of feel for my process of coming back to that idea of the immediacy of a photograph and the detachment of it being like an image of a person rather than a person.
And that's really interesting though, because your work that mean that your work comes mainly from media,
Yeah,
but
yeah, it
then it
does a
also
lot.
gets feeded back. It also gets feeds back into media. So I think that's like kind of this loop, continuous loop of that is really interesting because people come across on social media. Yeah, it's inspired by magazines and other kind of media, and like films and magazines and like campaigns are really interesting ideas to look at. Actually, that's very interesting. But how do you know that the image will be? I don't want to say good because that's not really the right word. Um,
I know what you mean. Like, how do I know it
yeah,
translates to a painting?
yeah, yeah. So
Um,
let me rephrase that. So yeah, so how do you know an image will be a good painting?
I don't think I do. I think it is honestly like so much trial and error. I have so many paintings that never became paintings and sketches that didn't work. And I think it is pure, for myself at least, it's pure like volume of materials. So, like I say, the folder of screenshots on my phone, the pile of magazines in my studio, it's like it's immersing myself in this imagery so much so that when I find the right one and it does work, there's hundreds of other options that wouldn't have worked. So it's never as simple as picking an image, cropping that image, painting that crop, done. It's never as simple as that. There's a real sort of, sometimes quicker than others, but often it will be multiple crops, multiple sketches from the crop, translating onto the canvas, trying out that composition, reworking it a little bit, altering the colors, deciding not to use blue for the thousandth time. Um, and yeah, so I think it is just sort of like saturating myself in images of the body again to sort of, like I was saying about opening that dialogue to remind myself that I'm in a body but also viewing bodies. It's doing that to sort of kickstart that process, I think. But yeah, I definitely don't know what's going to work. I mean, obviously, sort of trial and error and practice means I have a little bit of an idea of what is successful in a composition, and there a bit of the technicality comes into that. But most of the time, it is purely just trying something.
So how do you know when a painting's finished?
You don't. You just don't. There are so many of my paintings that are now finished, that I could go back to and change. Like there are paintings I've sold and are now hanging on people's walls that if they said, "Oh, do you want to work on this a bit more?" I'd be like, "Yeah." um, I think it's more to do with when you feel it's accomplishing what you wanted it to do, not necessarily that it gets to a point where there's no more that could be done to it, but almost that you're content that it's achieved something, not necessarily everything or anything in particular, but that it's interesting enough to be achieving something and creating some sort of dialogue, I think.
But that's a hard question to answer, though, to be
It's
fair.
a hard
And
question to
I think the thing about art, and I probably said it before in an interview, but I think the thing with art and the reason people create work and the reason people keep creating is because if you created your best piece ever, you would never need to create again.
Exactly.
Maybe by not always painting your best image, you're deliberately trying to sabotage yourself so you don't have to stop.
Oh, that's deep.
Because once you stop, there'll be nothing left.
That's true.
Um, that's just my thoughts.
I think there's definitely some logic to that though, because like you say, if like if an author wrote their best work, they'd never write anything else. So
Yeah.
you've got to keep trying stuff and trying new things and failing at certain things to be able to succeed at anything. So yeah.
So moving on, um, is there are there any particular artists you'd like to collaborate with, or would you consider collaborating with other people?
Oh yeah, I definitely would. Who would I like to work with? I mean, am I just name dropping here now so that I can?
Go right ahead.
I mean, I've already mentioned Andrew Salgado, and he's honestly my favorite artist of all time, and being able to work with him in any capacity would be insanely cool. Um, but I think I don't know. I'd love to work with some textile artists and try out new things with that. And like say, going back to what I was talking about with this sort of like the almost like silhouette cutout sort of thing I'm working with at the moment. It'd be really interesting to sort of translate that almost into I have this weird thing in my head, like an idea of like row of a row of hanging fabric that from the side is just lines, and then from the do you know what I mean? Those sort of
It's
things.
so weird. It's so weird you should say that because I was just thinking about that. Like, seriously, I was just thinking about something like that in terms of the dimensions of your work, in terms of literal dimensions of looking at it, because your work is very much about looking and about
Yeah,
viewing. And it's like,
yeah,
how can you translate that into like a physical, almost installation based way?
exactly.
Yeah, because your art is about looking, and because it's about viewing and voyeurism and about obviously detachment. And I think there's so many themes there you can explore in, particularly through something like installation, even like in a very different way that'll give your work a very interesting kind of outlook. That's not just a painting on a wall. And I think one thing I would personally like to say, and it's probably my own fault really for being quite restrictive in terms of where I look for artists and stuff, but I would love to see more of an emergence and acceptance of installation work and sculpture and kind of different forms of art other than just painting. You
Mm,
know, like my site is very based off painting, and I love painting, but that's not the whole of art. There's a much bigger scope,
absolutely.
you
Yeah,
know,
and I
and I
think it's definitely like painting's definitely it's like the pop of
yeah,
of art. You know, it's like it's the thing everyone immediately thinks of and everyone immediately goes to. Is like when you say if you say, "Oh, I'm going to an art exhibition," people would assume it's painting. So I definitely think there is like yeah a lack of appreciation for especially installation work. I went to uni with an artist called Bobby Forsyth, and she does these insanely cool like light and sculpture installation pieces. Um, so she did these ones where she had like resin shapes that then like sensor lights would come on as you walked through the exhibition. So and they were just the coolest thing ever. But she was like, it's so hard to photograph that or film it for people that weren't there at the time that it's really difficult to like translate that into an experience for like the consumer almost. She was like, I would have no idea how to sell one of my sculptures because it's not just about a physical thing, it's about the whole like setup.
it's the
Um,
experience.
exactly. And I think that's where art is potentially I think that's one of the things to sort of knock down in terms of making art more accessible is being able to harness this sort of access to a wider dimension of art that's not just paintings on a wall of a gallery.
Yeah, I think that's cool, and I think that yeah, that definitely needs to happen. 'Cause I think particularly like your work, for instance, like you could do so many different things with it, and like in so many different kind of varieties and different ways, and you want it to be just as successful as you selling paintings. You don't want to be like, okay, cool, you selling paintings are going to be like the most viable career for you. You don't want to be stuck doing that if you know that you can expand it in a different way to reach, a different whole demographic and a different audience. And
Exactly, yeah.
so, what are your thoughts on social media, and is it something you enjoy?
Um, I think in general, uh, yes, I enjoy it, and I think it in general it is a good thing. As a creative, it's a good tool to be able to um, sort of get exposure and learn and widen your audience, but also as a creative to be able to like find inspiration and explore different ideas. But I think as we touched on briefly earlier, I think it also can be detrimental to a creative process because it is obviously like a manufactured view of someone. So with artists especially, I think you can find yourself putting pressure on yourself to be like, well, I've got to be creative because I've got to post on Instagram, or like I've got to tweet a link to my upcoming exhibition, or I've got to share something because otherwise people think I'm not a proper artist, which is insane. um so in that respect, I think like with anything, and with social media as a whole, it definitely, that translates into real life as well. People worrying about, oh, I didn't take a good enough selfie, or oh, I need to get a photograph of my holiday that makes it look like it's sunnier than it is, all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Is this whole idea of like presenting the best version of yourself, which can be really dangerous and upsetting, but also can be really inspiring and motivating. And so I think it's sort of, I think I have a love-hate relationship with social media, both in my personal life and my creative life.
And how do you balance, kind of your personality and your professionality online?
Um, I think it's important to take sort of make sure that your professional persona and your personal persona are not too different, because then you're just, you're setting yourself up for failure. Like it would be silly for me to, for example, with my blogs, it would be silly for me to try and write in a style that then didn't translate to when I was talking to somebody. Like I like to write and present myself as a professional in the same way that I would in person. And so I think there's importance to sort of try and find the way you want to be perceived. And obviously, I'm not going to be going on like my professional Instagram and posting drunk selfies or anything like that.
I mean,
I probably wouldn't do that on my personal Instagram either. But there's got to be a divide. But I think you've also got to maintain. You've got to be a. I don't want to use the word approachable, but you've got to be a real person um, through social media as well. Like no one would want to meet an artist after, researching them and talking with them on social media or through email or something, then meet them in person, they're completely different. So I think I like to try and keep my social media presence and my blog sounding authentically like me without like oversharing and being too like pally and stuff,
yeah,
because it's professional. A lot of the time people are paying for your time or for your service, so you can't just be like, you know I don't even know an example of being unprofessional, but yeah, I guess the drunk selfies is what I'm going to go back to.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah, I
So,
think,
no,
sorry,
sorry, continue.
I was just going to say I think it is sort of like a balancing act of just basically being you, but also being like curating how you want to be seen in a professional manner, like you would, in a business meeting. You're not going to be chatting about, well, maybe I was going to
Absolutely.
say not going to be chatting about Netflix, but you probably will at the moment because there's nothing else to do.
Absolutely. So your work. So the interesting thing about your work is that because obviously you do look at the female form, and and there are like elements of nudity. I guess it's probably the best way to put it, because they're not. I wouldn't say they're strictly nudes, but they're like the elements of nudity. Like, how do you feel about social media guidelines and the idea of stunting such kind of images being shown to the wider public?
It's difficult because on a very base level, I'm very much like body positive. um and I think it is silly to have regulations, especially like with Instagram and Facebook in particular, in terms of censoring female nipple, or there's a whole free the nipple thing, female
Of course,
nipple
yeah,
versus male nipple, and all that sort of stuff. I think that at its base is unfair, but the problem, I think, it's problematic because it all comes back to like the notion that the female body is sexualized more than the male body is. And so it would almost be detrimental to encourage female nudity, because it wouldn't be from, unfortunately, it wouldn't be from the guise of empowerment. It would almost be like free porn, you know. Exactly. And so until, I think until the female body is not viewed sexually at first, as its first perceived value, there won't ever be this sort of equality of like censorship or the ability to um remove guidelines around what's like explicit and what's not, because it will always come back to a patriarchal gaze, which will then, which is dangerous and detrimental to women and,
Absolutely, yeah.
you know,
Absolutely.
non-males basically. So it's difficult in terms of wanting it to progress but not really knowing how it can without effectively altering society. So yeah, it's a tough one. I think there needs to be more development in terms of how it's assessed. We see so many like um Instagram users and accounts and images get flagged or get removed for no reason. There was a whole thing recently with I can't remember her name, a model called, I think her name's Naomi. I can't remember the first name. The last name, sorry. And she did a whole campaign because she kept posting the same image, and it's her. She's sat on a like a stool. She's nude, but she's covering her breasts and her um genitals, and it's not explicit in any way, shape, or form. And it kept over and over getting taken down. And she's a black female, and she's identified, and she lives in a fat body, and it's like they kept taking it down over and over again. She was like, this is exactly what we're talking about. If that was Kendall Jenner in exactly the same pose, no issue.
Yeah.
So there's it again, it draws into this whole argument of ableism, fat liberation, race, everything else under the sun. So it's hard to, I think there could definitely be more done in terms of how they monitor what's suitable content and how they choose what's um, censored and what's not, because I think it does also come down again to beauty standards, which yeah, so it's a difficult one. It's definitely something that needs addressing, but I'm not sure it can be addressed as simply as, oh, removing all like guidelines on monitoring and stuff. So yeah.
And do you think that as an artist who creates such work, you have a responsibility to keep track of where it ends up?
I think all artists do to a certain extent, but I also think with my work in particular, it's I think weirdly the painted medium almost desexualizes it, and so even if I were to paint something like really explicit, um, I still don't think it would be as explicit as a photograph. I think that's where medium comes into it as well as context. Is the way we view it comes back to that whole thing of being real or not, um, and whether once it's painted, it's still a real person. So, yeah, I think there's definitely a responsibility for me to sort of know where my work is being situated. But similarly, I think the painted image behaves very differently to the photographed image.
That's actually a really good point, and it's a really good consideration. So what I'm going to talk about in my next interview with the next painter that I interview, I'm going to definitely address that. I think that's a really good discussion. And so, would you say that you create art primarily for yourself or for the others?
Oh, that is a tough question. Um, I think both. I think I began creating art for myself, and I think now it's probably a combination of the two. I don't think I'd continue to be an artist if I wasn't in part doing it for myself, but I also don't think I'd continue to be an artist if I never got to show it to anyone, even if that was just, like my friends and family and just being like, oh, hey guys, I painted something, let me send you a picture of it. But I think if I didn't have the opportunity to share it at all, it would still be something I would do, but definitely not on the same scale. So I think it's probably a combination of the two in that, like I say, I've got to enjoy doing it, otherwise I wouldn't, and I've got to enjoy the outcome, otherwise I wouldn't do it. But at the same time, it would be less impactful for me as well to not experience people seeing my work. So I
Yeah.
think it's sort of like a, what's the word, symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, but it's almost like not a vicious cycle, but it's like a circle.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
a vicious cycle. I guess it
100%.
could be a vicious cycle. Um, okay, so the second to last question I'll ask you then, actually, this would probably be cool, is do you think that we live in a society that cultivates or curtails artistic freedom?
Oh, I would like to say it cultivates it, but I think I think our society encourages people to cultivate their own artistic freedom, but I don't think it does it itself. I think it can be restrictive to try to almost conform to what society expects from creatives. And so I think that can lead to, like we were talking earlier about being boxed in or not exploring enough, or, getting too hung up on trying to make money or not trying to make money or anything else, or basically expectations. So I think there's definitely an encouragement in contemporary society, in contemporary Western society anyway, to explore creativity. But until there is more even distribution of opportunity within our industry, I think it will be difficult for everyone to feel that art is something like pursuable and achievable as a life and not just as a hobby.
So yes, the last question really to ask you then, for now, I guess. What are you currently working on, and where can people find more about you and your work?
So currently I'm working on, like I mentioned earlier, some more embroidery work, but also some paintings. But they're sort of in progress in situ in my studio, which I can't currently access. Um, so I'm really interested at the moment, in sort of taking taking the figure and the body further away from recognizability. So I started out looking at silhouettes. I've been really I I was going to say invested, but I got it off Gumtree for like a tenner. But I got an overhead projector, which I've been loving, like playing around with, like in person silhouettes of myself, but also using like cutouts and layering and stuff like this. Um, so I'm working on some smaller embroideries with this idea of like silhouetting and color blocking the body to sort of explore how it can be abstracted but maintaining the realism of a silhouette, um, rather than like stylizing and sketching. So I'm working on stuff like that. Like I say, some paintings that are using similar things. But yeah, it's sort of, I've gone very much back to like a bit of an exploration bit. I haven't worked on any large paintings since last year actually, so a good couple of months. Um, but yeah, just sort of experimenting that, getting ready for my masters. That's been a lot of work in preparation and planning. Um, but yeah, so I'm looking forward to, in the next couple of months, transferring the smaller embroidered works into potentially large pieces, playing around with some sort of abstract block work, um, and just seeing where that takes me really. In terms of seeing that when it happens, I am on Instagram. I am at Felicity Paints. I am on Facebook, which is Beaumont Fine Art, or Felicity Beaumont Fine Art. But everything is on my website, which is just felicitybeaumont.com. But yeah, you can obviously find me on the Flying Fruit Bowl as well. So yeah, I'm all over the place. Give me a Google, I'll pop up.
That's absolutely perfect. You know what? Honestly, thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome.
I've had honestly an absolute great time, and your
Me
work is
too.
so fast. This concludes my interview with Felicity Beaumont. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any comments or questions, please shoot me an email at theflyingfruitbowl@gmail.com. Also, the Flying Fruit Bowl audio interviews are available on platforms such as Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Music. So if you like the show, please support it by subscribing or sharing with friends. As well as these audio interviews, I run theflyingfruitbowl.co.uk, which is a daily art inspiration website. If you're a fan of art and are looking to be inspired, please check it out. And if you're a creative, please get in touch for a chance to be featured or interviewed. Once again, thanks very much for listening, and until next time folks, please stay safe.